saying the Mediterranean diet is good for longevity, good for abdominal fat loss, good for cardiovascular disease is fine and dandy, except there are a lot of countries in the Mediterranean. We can't just group it all together. I mean, Spain is wildly different from Greece, which is wildly different from Italy. Then we've got Sicily, we've got Sardinia, we've got Turkey, technically. All these regions of the Mediterranean. So we group this all together and say, eat the quote unquote Mediterranean diet, which I am all for. I think there's a lot of benefit there, but I want to investigate it more. I want to understand which countries have the best Mediterranean diet and what do they eat? What makes them different? Well, we can't just cold turkey jump into this and say, okay, well, this country eats this, so I like this more. We need to look at the data first. So this video is going to unpack a large study first to understand which countries have the biggest impact from their diet. And then later on, we'll look at what that diet consists of. So let's go ahead and jump in. This first study was published in Current Opinions in Clinical Nutrition and Metabolic Care. It was interesting because it looked at a lot of literature and it helped us understand mainly the differences between Italy, Greece, and Spain when it came down to longevity and whatnot. Now, this was a large review that looked at epidemiological data as well as randomized control trials, looking at longevity, cardiovascular disease, abdominal fat, you name it. So let's first take a look at Greece. Now, the way that they did this is they looked at their adherence to a Mediterranean diet within that region. So basically, people that would adhere more or followed more of what they considered the Mediterranean approach within that region, they would give a score to. So in this particular case, it was 0 to 55. Someone that was a 55 was following the Mediterranean approach within Greece 100%. Right? Someone that was a 0 was barely following it at all. Basically, what they found in this particular case was that for every 1 point that someone adhered to the Mediterranean diet in Greece, there was somewhere between a 1 and a 4% improvement in their longevity or risk of cardiovascular disease in this case. Obviously, it could vary, and I'm sure the scale would tilt depending on how much closer you got, right? Bottom line is, that's a pretty strong correlation there. Basically, the more they adhered to this diet, the better improvement they had, or less risk they had. Now let's jump over to Italy for a second. There were 4 particular studies in this meta-analysis with follow-up periods of 50 years, 17 years, 4 years, and 12 years. So they were looking at this over a long period of time in multiple studies. Same kind of thing. The higher the adherence to an Italian Mediterranean diet, the lower the risk of mortality. No real surprise there. But there is a 30 to 40% reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality when there was a higher adherence to the Italian Mediterranean diet. So again, we don't have enough data to really look at it just yet, but it says that, okay, this is pretty interesting. People that follow the Italian Mediterranean diet really end up having a better health outcome, cardiovascular disease related wise and longevity-wise. Now let's look at Spain. Spain was interesting because they took a look at a couple of studies and they divided people in the top quartile, the top 1/4 of people that consumed closest to the Spanish Mediterranean diet compared to the bottom quartile, people that did not really adhere to the Spanish Mediterranean diet all that much. There was a 40% reduction in cardiovascular disease in that top quarter. And there was a 47% reduction in all-cause mortality in that top quarter compared to the bottom quarter. So looking at this data right out the gate, like adherence to the Spanish Mediterranean diet seemed to have the biggest impact, right? So biggest bang for the buck. So if I was adhering to a Spanish Mediterranean, I would probably get slightly better impact than if I was adhering to a Greek Mediterranean. But that's looking at CVD and mortality. Let's also look at diabetes and metabolism for just a moment. So in Greece, there's a study published in Diabetologia that was looking at 22,295 people. Big study. They gave a Mediterranean diet score of 1 to 10. 10 adhering, 1 not adhering. Basically, people that were a 6 or above, consuming basically 60% Mediterranean or above, ended up having a 12% less risk of developing diabetes or insulin resistance than those consuming a 3 or lower. So more adherence, less risk of diabetes, despite a fair amount of carbohydrates. But what's interesting in this particular study is they also looked at a low-carb version of it. If you took that same exact diet, but reduced the carbohydrate intake, that risk reduction went from 12% to 20%. So clearly the carbs are part of an issue with Greece. Like their diet is good, but when you reduce the carbs, their diet gets really good. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there. Let's look at Italy in terms of diabetes and just metabolic health real quick. There was a randomized controlled trial that looked at 180 subjects with metabolic syndrome. It divided them into 2 groups. One group went on an Italian Mediterranean diet. The other group went on a prudent diet, so more regular diet. Macronutrients were roughly the same, calories were the same. What mattered here was the food. They followed them around and 2 years later did a follow-up. The Mediterranean group lost more weight. They also had lower instances of inflammation and insulin resistance. As a matter of fact, at the end of the 2-year period, in the Mediterranean group, only 40 people still had clinical metabolic syndrome, whereas in the other prudent, healthy eating group, but not the same kind of foods, 78 of them still had clinical metabolic syndrome. So what's interesting here is, although I'm not a believer in like a naturalistic fallacy where everything that comes from nature is good and yada yada, I buy into some of it. The quality of food here did seem to matter. Like Mediterranean, it's not necessarily just about the calories or the macronutrients in this case. It is about the type of food, right? So that Mediterranean diet ended up being better. Okay, so yes, the Italian Mediterranean diet could be very good. Now let's look at Spain. So this Spanish study took a look at 11,000 people without diabetes or without cardiovascular disease and followed up with them 7 to 8 years later after following a Spanish Mediterranean diet. The highest adherence to a Mediterranean diet led to a 27% reduction in metabolic syndrome. So they had 27% less chance of developing metabolic syndrome over the 7 to 8 year period. Get this though, there was also a 37% less instance of abdominal obesity. So 37% less chance of getting fat in the abdomen, midsection. But get this, a 67% reduction in mortality. Over a 7 to 8 year follow-up, the stronger that Spaniards adhered to their Spanish Mediterranean diet, there was an even stronger correlation with reduced mortality, 67% reduced risk. Okay, so we have all the data, but now we need to look at what they actually eat. Let's understand this. Now, again, I'm gonna say, before I get into like what they actually eat, Mediterranean is good. Okay, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Mediterranean, but reducing carbohydrate intake along with it is even better, because that's probably the one potential problem in a sedentary lifestyle, is if Americans start to adopt a Mediterranean lifestyle or Mediterranean diet, we're far too sedentary to probably enjoy all the carbs that Europeans and Mediterraneans eat. They walk a lot more and move a lot more than we do in America. So they can compensate for those calories, or not even calories, but carbohydrates and glucose much more than we can. So it might be a wise idea to say, hey, let's take what they do and maybe back off the carbs a little bit. I put a link down below for Thrive Market, which you can skip over this portion if you want to. It's totally fine. Thrive Market is a sponsor on my channel. They are an online grocery store, and they have a whole Mediterranean region, like for their grocery shopping. So if you want like olive oil, if you want more Mediterranean style foods, like you can just type in Mediterranean at Thrive Market. And that is a 30% off discount link. So 30% off your entire first grocery order with Thrive Market, plus a free $60 gift. So load up your grocery cart, do your grocery shopping. They've got sustainable meat and seafood. They've got packaged food. They've got everything. They've got sardines. They've got all this Mediterranean stuff. And it's all in a better for you category, meaning no hidden nastiness, no dyes, no weird preservatives. That's what they're all about, bringing healthier food to the masses. So that link down below, check out Thrive Market, and a big thank you to them for continuing to support this channel after, like over half a decade. They've been helping us out for a long time. So that link, again, 30% off your whole grocery order in the top line of the description. Let's look at these diets now. So if you look at this graphic that's on the screen right now, this is interesting, because this takes a look at Italy, Greece, and Spain, and Chile's thrown in there too, because it was kind of from a different context. But if you look at Spain, you see that they have the highest meat, fish, and egg consumption out of any of these countries. which is interesting. And then you look at, like, say, Italy, they have a little bit more in the way of the cereals, the fruits, the veggies, and things like that. But interesting that Spain has the highest fish, egg, and meat consumption, yet they also had the highest impact in terms of health outcome with the most adherence to their diet. Spain flat out had a higher risk reduction with better adherence to their diet. And the data from large studies shows that. Yet they're also the ones out of the Mediterranean countries that seem to eat the most meat, fish, and eggs. And contrary to what a lot of people might think, Spain and Greece, they still eat a fair bit of meat, fish, and eggs. More so than we talk about in America. Sometimes in America, at least in the mainstream media, we kind of make it sound like they're almost vegan. They're not. And I have a lot of Europeans that watch my channel, and you know the deal. Like, in fact, last time I was in Europe, I didn't see like a single thing promoting plant-based or vegan, and I have no problem with it, but it's not like that's the movement or an agenda there. They maybe just eat a little less meat than the Americans do, but they're certainly not like abstaining from meat and dairy and fish and eggs. Anyhow, I digress. Perhaps more of the protein consumption in Spain is leading to better metabolic health outcomes and possibly better longevity. Interestingly enough, though, Spain does seem to have a higher BMI. Now, BMI doesn't necessarily equate for muscle mass, so we can't totally take that to the bank. However, maybe there's more stuff infiltrating into Spain now and people are becoming less healthy. But we can't just say Spain eats more meat, fish, and eggs, and that's why they have the bigger impact. First of all, backing up, all three of these countries we're talking about, Spain, Italy, Greece, are all phenomenal and doing great. Okay, we are splitting hairs, but I do like to get down to the granular and see what's best. So now let's look at ultra-processed food consumption. Which of these Mediterranean countries are consuming the least ultra-processed foods? Well, it looks as though Greece consumes about 5.9% ultra-processed food. Okay, then we have Spain also consuming about 5.9%. Italy coming in around 4.1%. So Italy seems to have the least ultra-processed food consumption by a fair amount. Now you compare this to like Belgium or more so like Netherlands and the UK, we're talking 20 to 30%. Talking America, we're talking, I don't even want to mention, it's ridiculous. 45% plus, some evidence even suggests more than 50. Okay, so 4.1% in Italy, low processed food. And definitely seems as though Italy wasn't far behind Spain in terms of the risk reduction impact from their diet. But we also have to factor in what we do know about carbohydrate consumption, and maybe there's just a lot more carbohydrates consumed in Italy. But we also know that quality of life in Italy seems to be higher too. It's one of the best quality of life scores in the European Union altogether. But the processed foods don't tell us everything. Because, for example, some categories will put meat in processed food. Now, if you look at the types of processed food consumed, Greece doesn't consume much in the way of like sausage or anything like that as a quote unquote processed food. Sausage, that is technically a processed food, even if it's healthy fermented sausage. So Greece doesn't show processed food, or doesn't show meat or sausage as a processed food in their top 5. But 20% of their processed food intake comes from crackers and refined bread products. And they also have a high amount of margarine consumption. So we've got trans fats coming in there. So their processed food consumption with meat is wildly different than, say, Spain coming in at like 9 to 12, 9 to 13% of their total ultra-processed food coming from sausages and meats, right? So sausages are not bad. There's not garbage in a lot of sausage, especially in the Mediterranean. Granted, like bologna and stuff like that isn't good. So interestingly enough, it's like, okay, Greece is consuming the same amount of processed foods roughly as Spain, but Spain's processed foods are less carb-based refined garbage and a little bit more in the way of sausages and stuff like that. By the way, Italy, out of that low 4.1% that they're consuming, they're already consuming up to 17% of those processed foods as sausages and possibly fermented meats and cured meats. Technically processed, but not bad, right? So their processed food intake is crazy low. So I think we can take some different things from here. Italy sets a standard for processed food, in my opinion. I think that is a model that we could go after. Like, I like their low ultra processed food. I like that their processed food intake that they do take is almost 20% coming from good quality sausages and things like that. So I think if we took that, we said, that's a great model. And then we took a look at, say, what Spain is doing. Okay, Mediterranean influence, still a lot of olive oil, still a lot of this, but a lot more in the way of the meat, the fish, the eggs, okay? Taking in that slightly higher protein that's coming in there. And then, of course, there's elements to Greece that are really good too. We still have a lot of good, healthy fats coming in from there. We just might need to reduce the carbohydrate intake. And what we've learned from those studies in Greece is that, hey, the Greek diet is still really, 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 really good. It gets really, 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 really good if we reduce the carbohydrate intake a little bit out of it. Mainly because their carbohydrate intake seems to be quite high from the ultra-processed food category. So if we were to just take that Greek style and reduce the processed foods in general, we might actually make them number one. That's what's pretty cool. So we learned a little bit from all of this, but a Mediterranean approach with slightly more meat, fish, and eggs seems to be where we want to go. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.